So this is our last installment of the new elevation certificate. So we're going over section C, D, and then the new sections H and I. So Tara's here to help me monitor the chat and keep people on mute. If you have questions as we go through, you can put them in the chat, and she usually answers it before we get to the end, but there will be time for sure at the end to have any discussions or go over any questions that you have. So what is the elevation certificate? So this is an official document that certifies and verifies the elevations of different structural aspects. So this is for new and substantially improved structures that are going into the floodplain is mostly what we're concerned with for floodplain management compliance. And so floodplain administrators review these for compliance with local, federal, state requirements. So this is only for structures. It's not for sections of property, but it can be used to support letters of map change applications as long as it's just for the structure. So the elevation certificate takes place of the elevation form. So it is a requirement for new and substantially improved structures. We have to be able to verify those elevations before it can be permitted. And so we have to have a finished elevation certificate, although the under construction ones can be helpful. And in Kansas, this is to be completed by a surveyor or an engineer, not an architect. And the form is not mandated by FEMA, but it's highly recommended because the form is a standardized way to receive those certified elevations. So there's really no reason to not use it. It definitely should be used by all participating communities in the NFIP. And so once it's certified, the elevation certificate does not expire. As long as it was certified on the form that was in use at the time, and it wasn't on an expired form, unless it was in that grace period. So depending on when it was certified, it doesn't expire. As long as it was on a valid form, it's only invalidated if there are changes to the actual structure that would change those elements. And so I just wanted to add this in here because we just got note of it yesterday. FEMA sent out a bulletin on the new form, and they just made a few tweaks to it to help it work better. So there were issues with being able to add text to those fields that were for numbers, because we're always telling you to put NA if it doesn't apply, and it wasn't allowing that. So they've gone through and fixed that. Apparently there was an issue with automatic rounding that has been fixed. Digital signatures are only going to lock the section that is being certified. Apparently that was a problem. There's a new instructions button. So on each page of the form, there's a button that says go to the instructions, and it will just take you there. And then once you're done, all of the instruction pages have a button that says return to form. So you can click back and forth for that ease of navigation. It's easier than scrolling back and forth. A6 specifies color photos. Yeah, I would have hoped that people were using color photos. H1A removed the word subgrade, and now it just references diagram 9. And then there were some updates to the functionality of the floodproofing certificate as well, and that was also on that bulletin. So if you have downloaded the form, because you have to save it to your device, if you downloaded it before November 6th, go back and re-download the new version of the form or the updated, corrected version of the form, to make sure that you have that more functional copy. So this is new. They just wanted to make some corrections to that, and I wanted to let you know. So this is where we are today. Section C and D, these are for the licensed professional. That's who can complete these sections, and then skipping all the way down to H and I, and that's anybody can fill out those sections, and the other ones are crossed off because we covered them previously the last 2 days, but those are recorded so you can go see them if you were not able to make it. Okay, so section C, the certified building elevation information. So this is for an area that has a base flood elevation or a flood depth. And so, as I said before, in an approximate zone A, there's not a base flood elevation, but for new construction in the floodplain, we have to develop one. So new zone A construction would also be in here. We need to get those certified elevations. Again, it has to be completed by a licensed surveyor or an engineer. And then C2 now clarifies that it can also be used for AO zones or A99 zones as well. And I don't think we have any A99 zones in Kansas, but if we ever got them, we can use Section C. So they have always requested that if you have to convert the datum that you put that information in the comments, but there's now a checkbox for that. So if yes, and then the reminder to put that in the Section D comments. And we'll talk a little bit about converting. It can also be used to determine the first floor height in any zone. So if you have this section filled out, it will prevail over any other sections with non-certified measurements. Attached garages are in C2D and are not enclosures, which would be the top of the bottom floor, C2A. And so I'll spend a little bit of time just going over that a little bit more, since there seems to have been confusion and FEMA's been trying to address confusion between what's an attached garage and what is an enclosure. So C2C, bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member, it says C instructions. It used to say V zones only, but they took that out since a lot of communities extend their V zone standards to their other coastal A zone areas. And like I said before, I've been told it might be useful information if you have a diagram 5 in a riverine situation. It's probably still not the lowest floor. It's not the lowest floor that you would be regulating to, but it might be helpful to have that information. I don't think you could have too much information, so it might be useful. So I just was putting that out there. C2, F, and G, so highest and lowest adjacent grade. So these are important, especially if you're using this to apply for a letter of map change. They now want you to indicate whether that was natural or finished grade. And right, I said there was issues with being able to enter text. That has been corrected now. So yeah, make sure you get the new form. There's a difference between natural and finished grade. Of course, natural grade has not been disturbed. It hasn't been excavated or there's no fill added to it. So they want you to indicate that. And I'm thinking that would probably come into play with the intervening higher grade concept that I discussed previously. So again, I just wanted to distinguish these floor terms because if you're not familiar with this, it can be confusing. So the bottom floor is the lowest floor, the lowest enclosed space. So that would be the basement floor. It would be the top of the crawl space floor. It could be an attached garage. Whatever the lowest floor of that structure is, the bottom floor. I know I just said lowest floor and that's the other term, but the lowest enclosed space. Whereas the lowest floor, again, this is a floodplain management term. It's interpreted by the floodplain administrator, and it typically means the lowest living floor. So the floor above the crawl space. If there's a basement, it would be the basement because that's like inside the house. If you have a full story enclosure, it would be the floor above the enclosure. And so it's a term that includes basements, but does not include other types of compliant enclosures. So hopefully that makes sense and it helps distinguish those two. And I do have another graphic for that. And then first floor height is an insurance term. It means the first floor that is at or above grade, and it's a rating variable under risk rating 2.0. And of course, that is going to vary by foundation type, which means the building diagram. And so we will talk about section H and how those are recorded for insurance purposes. So I think some of the confusion comes in here is because enclosures can look like and be treated like a garage. They often have garage doors on them like that. So on the left, we have the slab on grade. It's just a single story. There's only one floor. And so the one floor is the living floor. And that also means it's the bottom floor. It's the lowest enclosed space. There's no crawl space. There's no full story enclosure, nothing. And then adjacent to that is the attached garage. And so you can see that garage, it's attached to the house, but it's not an enclosure. It's just an area for storage and parking. It's not used to elevate the structure. Enclosures elevate structures. So on the right, you have a full story enclosure. Yes, it's the garage. It has the garage doors on it, but that is the bottom floor. It's a wet flood-proofed full story enclosure. And then as far as floodplain management, our lowest floor is above that. That's the living floor that we'd be concerned with, having it 1 foot above the base flood elevation. So hopefully that helps to clear that up a little bit and what they mean by that. And then just to fully close this up, what does FEMA consider the lowest floor? Again, floodplain management term, the lowest enclosed area except for an unfinished or flood-resistant enclosure that's used solely for parking or building access or storage. If it's used for anything other than that, the floor that is of that area is considered the lowest floor. So if you turn that full story enclosure into a living space and you have TV and carpeting and finishing in there, that would then become the lowest floor and probably non-compliant. So the floor of a basement will always be the lowest floor regardless of how the space is used, basically because it's part of the inside of the house. Okay, so line C1, this is pretty much the same as it always has been. What are the elevations based on? Drawings, a building under construction, or the finished construction. There is a reminder that the finished elevation certificate is going to be required. So again, you might want to consider requiring under construction elevation certificates or having some kind of documentation that will show you what the finished elevations are supposed to be. Again, we're trying to monitor compliance and avoid violations that could cause issues later on. It's part of verifying the site plans, doing inspections, looking at where the site is staked out, and doing inspections during construction. It's supposed to be part of the regular permitting process, and it's an important part of avoiding those things happening. Low floor violations are difficult to fix, as I mentioned. So line C2, we have the space for the benchmark that is used and that vertical datum. We're just talking a lot about datums today, making sure that all of the datums are consistent between the base flood elevation and our certified elevations. So it used to be FEMA would just put the benchmarks in the user notes on the map, and it was like a nail in a tree or something in a fence post somewhere that could have been changed or moved. But now the benchmarks are registered with the National Geodetic Survey. Yeah, survey. So you can look them up online. There's an interactive map where you can find them, and they all have a unique ID number. And there's different types. There's vertical and horizontal benchmarks that are registered there, so you can find them on the map and locate them exactly. Or there are other organizations that maintain benchmarks, so you would want to check with them if it's not the NGS. So the vertical datum for the benchmark, the elevations in C have to be in the same datum as the BFE, and they mention that several times throughout the form, just to make sure that there aren't any mismatched datums, because again, they can be quite different. The further west you go in the country, it will make a big difference. So if you use a conversion, and there's a checkbox for that now, if yes, then you need to describe the source of the conversion and then describe it in the comments section. So they are really trying to emphasize that. I think it's been missed a lot before, so they've really tried to prompt you to put it in the comments section. So you want to indicate the benchmark for the base station for a GPS survey, or there's Opus, and we'll take a look at that. But basically, you get a report from that, and then that would be an attachment. So we'll look at the Opus thing, but yeah. So we have had issues with survey stakes before. They've been misread by the contractor, and then a low floor violation happens, or there have been property owners that come out and for whatever reason push them down into the ground. And that has led to low floor violations. And again, that's a costly error. So this is where inspections come into play. You might meet with the contractor or the surveyor to ensure that things are being read correctly or that they haven't been altered either intentionally or unintentionally. Again, once the site is staked out, you should be doing an inspection, and when the foundation's being put in, you should do an inspection. And make sure that it matches the plans that were submitted to you and that you approved, and you might want to be checking the setbacks and other things. So yeah, National Geodetic Survey. So you can just go here, you can download shape files, and it shows you exactly where all of them are and what they are. So yeah, there's an interactive map. It seems pretty straightforward, easy to use. Yeah, FEMA stopped adding that information to the map and the user notes and everything. Now they just refer you to the NGS. So VertCon, this is the conversion software. Again, we want to make sure that the datums are the same. So if we have to convert them, we're using software and documenting that. And then this is just a chart or a graph showing you how different the two datums can be as you go west. So it could be up to 40 centimeters, and that's quite a big difference in western Kansas. So that could be a very big mistake if you are mismatching the datums between the base flood elevation and the certified elevations of the structure. So I went to look this up earlier today. It used to be NCAT, like up until last year, I think, which was the NGS coordinate and transformation tool, but they do have that retained for historical context. And now we have VertCon 2.1, and this is downloadable software, so it's not a web page anymore. You would download the software and then use it that way. Again, you would want to put that in the comments section, and the same with Opus. So, using the satellites to get your elevations there. So for the GPS survey, you'd want to indicate the benchmark, and then have the online positioning user service. That's what Opus is. So you get that report and then attach it to the certificate. And then we have C2A through H. So we've ensured that the datums are converted properly. So again, verify that, do the checkbox. And then again, this is where the terminology becomes important, what top of the bottom floor means. So we've had violations just because people misunderstood what the top of the bottom floor meant. Like they thought it might mean the ceiling of the basement would have to be 1 foot above the base flood elevation. And so that's an issue. Yeah, we need to make sure that they know that it would be the basement floor and that they can't have a basement anyways. So going through these terms with your applicants, and I mean, that really goes back into permitting, but also like making sure contractors are understanding what's required of them. Again, nothing should be left blank. If it doesn't apply, enter NA, which you should be able to do now. And then these measurements are going to depend on the building diagram. So it's important when we get an elevation certificate to go back and look at the section A and make sure that the entries there are lining up with what we have in section C. as far as flood openings. So we should be looking for some kind of an enclosure. Yeah, that kind of thing. And verifying that building diagram works, and then going to the comments section and verifying any anomalies with that. Again, C2C could be used in any zone. The instructions clarify that now, that for diagram 5 and 6, it can be used in any zone. It might be helpful, I guess, if you have debris lines that you want to measure, ice jams, you might want that information. And again, all diagrams have a lowest horizontal structural member. They just might be below ground. So, not something you would be taking a measurement on, but it is there. And of course, we use feet here in the continental United States, so don't use meters. And then, of course, the diagram illustrations show you where to take these measurements. So diagram 1A, the slab on grade, it's just going to be the top of the slab. The same for 1B. Diagram 2A and 2B, it's always going to be the basement floor, and then C2B would be the floor above the basement. Diagram 3, it's another slab on grade, and then diagram 4, it's another basement, so it would be the basement floor. Diagram 5, it's the elevated floor. C2B is again the next higher floor, and then that's where you see C2C would be the lowest horizontal structural member underneath the lowest floor, or the top of the bottom floor. And then diagram 6 is C2A would be the floor of that partial enclosure. It would also have a C2C that could be measured, and then C2B would be the elevated floor above that. And then it also is pointing out A8, which would be where the flood openings are. Diagram 7, that's the full story enclosure. So C2A is the enclosure floor, C2B is the floor above that. A8, the flood openings are there. And then it's also showing you C2F and C2G, so the lowest and highest adjacent grade. And then the same thing for crawl space. It's the top of the bottom floor is the crawl space floor. The floor above that, C2B, is the elevated floor. And then the same diagram 9 is the top of the subgrade crawl space floor, and then C2B is above that. So it's pretty straightforward. These illustrations were always in there, but these have been updated, I think, just to make them more clear. So it shows you exactly for the slab building, C2A on top of that, and then C2C, the lowest horizontal structural member, is underneath that, and it looks like it's probably below grade on that. Because again, some diagrams, that's how it's going to be. Building with a basement, C2A, basement floor, and then piers, posts, or columns, it shows you C2A and C2C again. So yeah, just a little bit of update to these sketches. And then just a real life example. So C2F, the lowest adjacent grade would be at the bottom of that ramp. So this looks like a 1B. And then comment section D, again, that's sort of if you're trying to get that intervening higher grade, that you would discuss that in the comments and maybe attach a sketch. But again, it's mostly for natural grade and not covered in concrete. So just another example here, you have an attached garage in this one. So you would be filling out A9 and C2D for the attached garage. So you have flood openings, it's wet flood proofed, elevated utilities, but C2E is the lowest machinery or equipment that's servicing the building. In this case, it's a hot water heater. And then you have an electrical box wired from the ceiling, but that's not the lowest machinery and equipment. And then you have the base flood elevation coming in just above the garage floor there. And then, of course, the house is elevated. It looks like maybe on fill or natural grade. So C2F, G, and H. So this is lowest adjacent grade, highest adjacent grade, and then the deck or stairs that are structurally attached to the building. So C2F, they're asking whether it's natural or finished. And again, the lowest adjacent grade next to and in direct contact with the building foundation. So again, natural grade, undisturbed, no excavation, no fill. And then the instructions really emphasize in zone AO that you want to use natural grade if possible, and then attach that source information, such as a grading plan. And I heard it suggested that if there is fill in the zone AO, that you might want to do like a soil boring or somehow get the natural grade information. And then the same thing for highest adjacent grade. In the zone AO, that they would still want that same supporting source of information and then attach that to the form. So I'm not entirely sure why it's highly emphasized for zone AO, but it is. And then H, the lowest ground, sidewalk, or patio slab that's next to and structurally attached, either deck supports or stairs that are structurally attached to the building. And I have seen it where you have like wooden or metal stairs that are right next to the building, and they may be like attached somehow laterally, but they're not structurally connected. And the same thing is popular for decks. Like you might have floating or freestanding deck that's right next to the structure. Or it could be structurally attached where it relies on both the structural post and the house framing for support. And so it can be hard to tell the difference without really getting in there or seeing how it was constructed. So something that looks structurally connected may actually not be. And this is also something that's going to be required to be at or above the lowest adjacent grade for a letter of map change, like a LOMA. So distinguishing whether or not it's structurally connected could be an important factor in that. So I just wanted to point it out. Sometimes a crawl space is not accessible. So the instructions describe a couple of different methods that you might have to use to get that measurement. You could measure the distance from the crawl space floor to the next higher floor and then subtract it from the exterior. So measure that to the next higher floor and then subtract it from the crawl space floor. The floodplain administrator might have this information that's based on the construction and permitting for an existing structure, or the property owner might have documentation on the construction, and you might be able to verify that by looking in through the flood openings. So yeah, that's just the methodology that they give in case it's inaccessible, and then you would put that in section D, explain how this elevation was obtained. And yeah, sometimes it's accessible from the inside or the outside, it will depend. And then C2E, the lowest machinery and equipment that is servicing the building. So even if that is something on the roof, it needs to be recorded in C2E. So before FEMA was requiring them to be elevated to or above the base flood elevation, they were paying out a lot of claims on HVAC systems that were being completely inundated and submerged for periods of time. And then that was a complete loss. So they would have to pay out on those policies. So it would be common to leave these outside on the ground. In this picture, you can see the debris line where it was submerged. So now they make sure that utilities are at least elevated to or above the base flood elevation. And this is something that we have to enforce now. So, it's common to elevate the house and then just leave stuff out on the ground. So you can see in this one how the lowest floor is elevated, but the HVAC system was not. And this is still a compliance issue. It would still be a violation of regulations. And of course, this is completely separate from the machinery and equipment discount that people can get now. Again, this is to or above the base flood elevation unless you have adopted freeboard requirements. So class 8 and higher CRS communities have to adopt and enforce regulations that have the machinery and equipment with freeboard. I Ran into a case recently, some questions about like utility boxes that were servicing structures in the floodplain, but they were not owned by the property owners, they were owned by the local electrical company and they were in their own enclosure. And so when I asked about it, utilities owned by a company are not part of C2E because the property owner cannot control where those are placed, and it's also not part of their insurance policy. So just putting that out there is something I got clarification on recently. So it used to be in the olden days before risk rating 2.0 that if you left your utilities on the floor, on the ground, they weren't elevated, it could change your rating floor, which could make your insurance like 10 times more expensive. That's not the case anymore. Property owners are not penalized as far as their insurance policies. It's all about first floor height and those other rating variables. So this has strictly become a floodplain management compliance issue, so we don't have insurance backing us up on that anymore. So that does make things a little bit more difficult, but it's still something that we have to enforce. That is not changing. Floodplain management so far has not changed. There is talk about changing rules in the NFIP. Some things about our grants are changing, but anyways, a little bit of disconnect there. So the only question about machinery and equipment on the flood insurance application is about mitigation credits, and that is a flat 5% credit if you have it elevated high enough depending on your building diagram foundation type. And then again, technical bulletin 1 has the requirements for flood openings in foundation walls. And then yeah, proper flood venting, having the openings between 3 and 27% discount. I showed that chart yesterday, but if you want to see it, you can look at the risk rating discount guide. So it will talk about these different mitigation credits that can be given for these different things. Additionally, that could be lowest adjacent grade. There's a first floor height discount. They're all percentages. Your foundation type, the construction type, how many stories you have, all of that goes into it. And then, of course, we still have those statutory discounts such as newly mapped procedures and some other things in there. So if you're curious about insurance discounts, they're all available. You might look at the flood insurance manual as well. Just some tips on insurance. So some common errors that we've seen before, not on the new form just yet because it just came out, but historically, if C2A is not measured from the basement or crawl space floor, they might be using the living floor instead of that lowest enclosed space. C2B for a multi-story building is left blank. You know, in the next higher floor, there should be a number there, or it's recorded as the same as C2A. Of course, if it's just one story, it should say NA in it. C2C would be left blank instead of NA. And then I mentioned maybe we'd be adding values to that in a riverine situation for a diagram 5 or a diagram 6. C2D left blank, and then it's not clear if there's no garage or if you just missed it. So that adds confusion, especially if maybe A9 was filled out and then this is left blank, that kind of thing. C2E left blank, or it's not described in the comment section. So you're supposed to go in and describe what the lowest machinery and equipment is in the comment section, put its general location, and of course that would include any electrical, heating, ventilation, plumbing, all of that, even if it's in a separate enclosure, again, unless it's something that's not owned by the property owner and is operated by someone else. C2H left blank when it should have had an A or a number. Again, that's an attached, structurally attached deck or stairs. And then we might require that information about ductwork to be documented. Again, probably if we have that machinery and equipment freeboard adopted. And if it's mounted to a wall or a pile, you would enter the platform elevation. So the instructions describe how C2E should be done. So make sure you look at that. So there's the new CRS checklist on what's going to be required and what has to be correct for the CRS community annual certificate review. And there's guidance on that. There's a checklist in addition to this annotated form. And so you shouldn't be, of course, accepting any incomplete certificates. Hopefully having that email address in there will help streamline communication and getting those corrections done and sent back to you, since it can all be done electronically now. So a finished and correct elevation certificate should be conditional of you issuing the certificate of occupancy. So withholding that has often been a very good tool, because they often can't get utilities connected until they have that certificate. So making sure you have that complete application form, and that would include providing the finished and correct elevation certificate. And again, if we're in a floodway, we need that no-rise certification in addition to the elevation certificate if you allow construction in your floodway. I know Nebraska doesn't. So floodways can be dangerous because the water is moving very fast. It's used to discharge those floodwaters. So that's why we require the no rise. It's a federal requirement. You cannot add fill to the floodway. And so the engineer must evaluate the hydraulic impact of the proposed development and then provide that analysis and the statement that certifies that it will not cause any rise in the base flood elevation. Signed, sealed, and dated by the engineers. So you need that documentation before you approve new development there. And then just a little bit more on these different foundation types, how we elevate structures in different ways. So the first one is a crawl space. I don't see any flood openings, but we'll just pretend that they're on there. So the utilities are elevated above the base flood elevation, and it should have flood openings. And again, this is an enclosure, but it's not treated as a garage because I couldn't, park my car in a crawl space, or at least I shouldn't try to do that. So again, an enclosure versus a garage, they can be the same thing, but they're not always the same thing. And then fill. Often in Kansas, we require a statement that says it's not going to have any construction debris. So sometimes people try to put construction debris in the fill, and that's not good. We want clean fill. It can have rocks and rubble in it, just not any construction debris. And then that goes hand in hand with the DWR floodplain permit that is going to be required if you have on average a foot or more of fill. So that would be the state permit you would need for floodplain fill, in addition to the local permit and then any required federal permits. And then there are additional design requirements for having vegetation on that fill to prevent erosion and how it can be sloped, usually a 1-to-1 ratio, vertical to horizontal. And then just a little bit about accessory structures, because this comes up so much. They are considered a structure. No matter how small, they do need a permit, and they would have to be elevated and have an elevation certificate like any other non-residential building, unless they meet all of these standards for being allowed to be wet flood proofed. And so it can be allowed by permit only, as long as all of these conditions are documented on that permit, including the flood openings. So we want to see on the permit how many openings it has, what that net area opening is, and compare that to the enclosed space, the size of the accessory structure. So it has to be within 600 square feet. It's not habitable, it's properly anchored. Of course, it has those flood openings. It's made of flood damage resistant materials. It has elevated utilities above the base flood elevation, and it's used for storage or parking only, and you cannot modify that use in the future. So this is something we deal with all the time, and people don't put in the work to get them, permitted and make sure that they're anchored and have the flood openings. So agricultural structures, another common thing here in Kansas. Again, it would have to be elevated and have an elevation certificate like any other non-residential structure unless they meet their own standards for wet flood proofing. Single wall design, not habitable, anchored, flood damage resistant materials. And another thing that really trips people up and prevents a lot of structures from being considered agricultural is that no permanent retail, wholesale, or manufacturing use. That often precludes a lot of structures that would otherwise be eligible for it. People sell their agricultural goods out of the same building, and then it just makes it a regular non-residential commercial use, and so it can't be wet flood proofed at that point. There's no employment or entertainment uses, and that is strictly or explicitly outlined in the guidance. It also has to have a variance. That's another thing that FEMA's really been emphasizing, and they clarified that all agricultural structures must have an approved variance to be allowed to be wet flood proofed, just because of the diverse nature of agricultural structures. And obviously the flood openings, and you can clearly see the flood openings on this structure, but there is no size limitation on these, unlike the accessory structures. And then this is the guidance on that, P20-2140. It's very detailed. There's lots of examples and model ordinance language and guidance on how to do a community-wide exception. It should be pointed out that some agricultural structures are high hazard and they should not be wet flood proofed. So after all of that, once we have our certified elevations, the instructions go over Section D. They really emphasize the whole Code 1001, the 18 U.S. Criminal Code, basically, that you can't falsify statements in here, which I've never dealt with or anything. So it asks, were the latitude and longitude in Section A provided by a licensed land surveyor, yes or no? Check here if there are attachments and then make sure you attach that. Name, license number, title, company name, the address, number, and then again, the email is going to be important for streamlined communication. The date is going to be important to make sure that this was certified on the appropriate form when it was signed and sealed. There's a place for the seal. And then the instructions go on to describe what all should be in the comments. So your supporting information for the latitude and longitude, how you establish that. The openings rating is that certificate from the International Code Council Evaluation Services, that number, that certificate should be on there for the rating. And then in the comments section, you would indicate the manufacturer and the model number. If the structure is located somewhere in a low MAR area or other types of letters of map change, if it's been revised by an approved letter of map change, you put that case number and the effective dates in the comment section. The base flood elevation source data, if it was something other than what they have in Section B. The datum conversion for C2, the grading plan for natural grade, if you're in an AO zone for F and G, C2, F, and G, the machinery type and location for C2E, and then any other relevant information because they are really looking for descriptive comments in here. This should definitely not be left blank by anyone. There should be something in there. And then the instructions pretty much always tell you if there's something different, just put it in the comments. And again, that signature means you're certifying your best efforts to interpret the data and it's accurate. Because the licensing board, their license could be at risk if they purposefully falsified information. Which I don't think anyone here would do, but it is a crime. And then sections H and I. So again, this is for insurance purposes only. And it's only to determine the first floor height. Again, this can be completed by anyone. A survey is not needed. So there's just 3 questions in this section. It's to establish what the first floor height is, and then a question about is the M&E elevated based on the foundation type. And then section I is just a certification section. It's much like all the other sections, which would be used if H is filled out. Unless you're the community official, you would go back to section G and then certify in there. And it's not required to get a policy, but if you provide this to your insurance agent, it may lower the premium if it's beneficial to you and help you earn those discounts. If it's not beneficial to you, they will just go with what they had before. So I just wanted to, again, throw this up there. Since they had this one specifically for H&I, again, the FPA or the floodplain administrator local official will go back to section G. And then if you're filling out section H, you need to also make sure that section A and B are also filled out, which are also things that can be filled out by anyone. So that's your property information and your map information. So this is, again, only for flood insurance. A, B, and I must also be completed. If you're just doing first floor height, they prefer that you use this section over section E, which we typically in Kansas only use for zone AO anyways. So if section C is completed, that prevails over H or E if those are filled out. So again, it's just 3 questions. So for H1A, diagrams 1A, 1B, 3, and those are all the slab on grades, and then 5 through 8 are elevated. The top of the bottom floor above the lowest adjacent grade. And then H1B, diagrams 2A, 2B, 4, and then 6 through 9, which all have below grade areas. It's going to be the top of the next higher floor above the basement, crawl space, or enclosure. So H1A, there's no floors below the ground level for that question. It's always at or above grade for H1A. And then H1B, basements and below grade crawl spaces, we're recording with the next higher floor above that. So H1A would be blank, or you'd put NA. And then the last question, H2, is M and E elevated appropriately, depending on that diagram. And so again, we're just out here with tape measures or rulers, just regular measuring tools to measure the relative distance from the top of the floor to the existing lowest adjacent grade. The as-built grade, again, this is not survey data. It's just us out there with measuring tools. So H1B, next higher floor above the basement, crawl space, or enclosure, and then H1B is left blank for diagrams 1A, 1B, and 3. And again, those are the slabs on grade. So hopefully that makes sense. And we're just measuring how high off the ground is the first floor that's at or above grade. And then the machinery or equipment, again, it depends on what kind of foundation you have. So slab on grade, it has to be to the next higher floor or to the attic level if it's a 1-story. Diagram 5 underneath that, it's the elevated floor. And so they tell you where to take these couple of measurements depending on the diagram type. So like diagram 6, you have H1A at the enclosure floor, H1B is above that, and then H2 is about the machinery and equipment. So this is in the instructions for section H. And then this one, I think, is from the flood insurance manual, and it tells you where to elevate the machinery and equipment, basically to the elevated floor. Or if you have a crawl space, it's the floor above the crawl space. Or if you have a basement, it's the floor above the basement. And yeah. Okay. And then just a couple of resources that you might need. Of course, always look at the instructions if you're not sure on the elevation certificate. There's also the flood insurance manual that was updated in October of 2022. The MT1 technical guidance for filling out those letters of map change applications. The letter of map amendment out as shown. So if it's not technically in the floodplain, you don't need a survey to get it out. And then the claims manual was actually just updated in June, which I just discovered. And then again, we're always referring people to the Kansas Society of Land Surveyors if they come to us looking for a surveyor. We also have a handout that has tips for hiring a surveyor and considering quoting travel time, costs, all of that. Okay. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So if you missed any of these, we have the other ones recorded. We should be adding those pretty soon. If you want a certificate for this class, then send me an email. I'll get that out to you. So yeah, stop sharing. I didn't see anything coming through in the chat. Well, if you do have questions, you can come off mute. But otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you have further questions that you think of later, send me an email or call me. I can, go through any specific situations with you.